Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down some pretty big ideas. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paper that asks a pretty radical question about the entire field of psychology.
So, let's get right into it. The source we're looking at today argues that before a patient even says a single word, modern psychology has already made an invisible decision about what's wrong with them, and it's all based on this hidden map of reality that it uses.
All right, so this invisible map, this blueprint, it's really the heart of the whole argument. So let's start to unpack it.
So get this, the paper claims that psychology's main diagnostic manual, think of the DSM, isn't just a simple checklist of symptoms. Nope, it argues that a whole worldview is baked right into it, a worldview of scientific materialism. And because of that, it kind of predetermines and limits the answers you're even allowed to find.
Okay, so what is this dominant blueprint exactly? Well, the source traces it back to the European Enlightenment. And look, let's be clear, this framework has given us some absolutely incredible tools. I mean, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, life-saving pharmaceuticals. This isn't about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But this blueprint, it's all built on one single, really powerful assumption. The source gives it a name: ontological materialism. It's basically the idea that what you see is all there is. Reality is just physical stuff. So, what this means is that the human being is seen as, well, a really complex biological machine. Your thoughts, your emotions, your consciousness, it's all just brain states in neurochemistry. The paper has this really stark way of putting it. The ghost has been exorcised from the machine. All that's left is the machine. But then, the paper pivots. It proposes a totally, radically different blueprint. This one is drawn from a really ancient worldview that it calls the Divine Council Worldview, or DCW for short. And its roots are in the cosmology of the Hebrew Bible. Now, in this view, a human person is way more than just the sum of their physical parts. And to make this case, the source does something really interesting. It dives into the ancient Hebrew vocabulary that was used to describe our inner life. And this is where it gets super interesting. See, unlike how we often talk about a separate mind and body, ancient Hebrew used these really integrated terms. You have nephesh, which is the whole living, breathing person, not just a soul, but the entire being. Then there's ruach, that's the animating force, the spirit, the energy of life. And finally, leb, the heart, which they saw as the center of thinking and decision-making. But here's the key. These terms aren't neat little boxes. They all overlap. They paint this picture of a person as a deeply integrated whole. And think about what that means for therapy, right? It suggests you can't just treat a mental problem in isolation. You have to consider the spiritual and the physical, because from this perspective, they were never separate things to begin with. Okay, so now we have these two competing blueprints on the table, right? The machine versus the image bearer. And the paper argues that depending on which blueprint you use, you're going to get fundamentally different answers to the biggest questions about why we suffer. So, on one hand, the materialist blueprint looks for answers in things we can measure: brain chemistry, genetics, trauma in your environment. But the DCW? It offers something completely different, a specific cosmic backstory to explain why the world is so broken.
And this framework lays out a very specific story about suffering. It's not just random chaos, right? It's seen as the direct result of these major historical rebellions in the spiritual world. According to this worldview, these events are what broke humanity's original relationship with the Creator and, critically, introduced hostile spiritual forces into the world that still influence our lives and our societies today.
To kind of test this idea, the paper brings up a famous story from the Bible as a case study, one that it argues just doesn't fit into a purely psychological box. It's the story of the Gadarene demoniac. In it, Jesus confronts a man, but he doesn't just talk to the man, he addresses these other entities inside him. And then, something happens in the physical world. And here's the kicker, the point the paper really hangs on. The story ends with a herd of pigs running off a cliff. So it's not just something happening in the man's head. The event had real, external, physical consequences. And the paper's question is, how do you explain that? It says, no account of something like a psychotic projection can make a bunch of pigs run into a sea. But, and this is really important, the source is super careful to warn against swinging the pendulum too far in the other direction. It points out two big mistakes people can make. On one side, you have psychiatric reductionism, where everything is seen as a natural biological problem. It just ignores any spiritual reality. But on the other side, there's what it calls a hyper-charismatic collapse, where everything is seen as a supernatural problem and clinical reality gets ignored. The paper says both of these are dead ends.
And all of this leads to the final and maybe the most important point of disagreement between these two blueprints. What does real healing actually look like? So the paper makes this really sharp contrast. It says the goal of a lot of modern therapy is basically better adaptation. Helping a person function better and be more resilient within a broken world, which is a good thing. But the DCW's vision is something else entirely. It's cosmic restoration. The goal isn't just to fix the individual, but to participate in the healing of the entire cosmic order. The scale is just massive.
So from this DCW perspective, therapy or healing isn't just about, say, reframing your negative thoughts. It's about something much deeper. It's about being reconnected to the Creator, having that broken relationship restored. And it's about actively participating in a cosmic victory over those hostile forces we talked about. And so ultimately, the paper leaves us with this one big question. Is a patient a brain that's just seeking equilibrium? Or are they an image bearer caught up in a vast cosmic story? Because as the paper argues, the blueprint you start with, the map you use to see a person, it totally determines the kind of help you can even offer. And maybe, just maybe, our modern map has been missing a huge chunk of the territory this whole time.